Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're going to give a couple of minutes or 1 minute while people join. Bienvenidos y bienvenidas. Vamos a dar un minuto mientras las personas terminan de unirse. Gracias por estar aquí. While we start, please write your name, organization, and where you're joining from. And remember to select everyone when writing in the chat, because it automatically sends messages to panelists only. Por favor, incluyan su nombre, organización y de dónde de dónde se unen. Y recuerden seleccionar que sea para todos, ya que el Zoom lo hace automáticamente solamente para panelistas. Esta sesión será en inglés. Tenemos traducción disponible. Entonces asegúrense de ubicar la configuración de traducción si necesitan escuchar en español. We will start in a couple of seconds. Thank you. Hello, Scott. Hello, Esteban. It's nice to see that you're joining us. Okay, so I would like to, again, take this opportunity to thank our sponsors, JP Morgan, WWF, the Packard Foundation, and the Pacifico Foundation, as well as the two hosts of this Congress, Forever Costa Rica Association and FONAFIFO. I would now like to welcome Kathryn Mathias, who is the Conservation Finance Project Manager for the Wildlife Conservation Society. And she also collaborates and supports the work of the Conservation Finance Alliance, CFA. She is the co-author of the Annual Conservation Trust Investment Survey, CTIS, which is a study of the investment management practices of conservation trust funds. She's also the project manager of all the educational projects related to the CTIS and serves as a consultant to conservation trust funds and other organizations on governance, resource mobilization, organizational effectiveness, and risk management. She's the co-author of Conservation Trust Funds 2020, Global Vision, Local Action. And from 2015 to 2017, she led the Secretariat of the Conservation Finance Alliance through an institutional transition and continues to provide support on special projects. Katie earned a master's in public and private management from Yale School of Management, with concentrations in strategy and finance, and a bachelor's degree in political science from Tufts University. Welcome, Katie, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Maria Luisa, and thank you to everyone. It's so nice to be here with you, and I wish we could be in person. I look forward to when that can happen again. The panel that you're about to see is not only part of the RedLAC Assembly, but also part of a webinar series that the Conservation Finance Alliance has been hosting for the last 9 months. In October of 2020, the CFA launched the 2020 edition of the Practice Standards for Conservation Trust Funds. This comprehensive effort was put together by the Environmental Funds Working Group of the Conservation Finance Alliance, with a dedicated task force of volunteers who worked throughout really 2 years to work on this update of the 2014 edition, which was written by Barry Spergel and Kathy McKeaton. So the 2020 edition builds on that original base of the original edition from 2014. The consulting team from Wolf's Company and Aligning Visions did the work on both the update of the practice standards as well as the 10-year review of conservation trust funds, which, as Maria Luisa mentioned in the introduction, was Conservation Trust Funds 2020 Global Vision Local Action. we were lucky to have them working on that and being able to combine those two projects so that the practice standards benefited from the 10-year review and vice versa. And one task force was able to work on both projects with the consulting team. So in January of this year, we launched a webinar series. Each month, we delve into a different area of the practice standards. There have been 8 so far. This is the 9th. And is basically being co-produced with RedLAC, as all of the webinars have been this year. So we started with a general overview, and then in each of the subsequent months, February through August, we've tackled a different new core area or cross-cutting theme from the practice standards. And you see the list of topics that we've covered so far. All of these webinars have been recorded and are available on the CFA website. We'll put up the link to the webinar series and invite you to please visit the past recordings of any that you're interested in learning more about. They're intended, and they follow a similar format to the session that we'll have today, which is they're intended to provide both an overview and context of topic as well as specific case studies on how conservation trust funds have been using the standards in those specific areas. So today we'll have a context overview by Viviana Lujan, who is one of the co-authors of the 2020 edition of the practice standards, as well as case studies from Pact Belize and from the Micronesia Conservation Trust. So with that, let me turn over to Viviana, who will give an overview on this context, on the topic of accreditation and how conservation trust funds have used the practice standards to support their efforts to be accredited to major multilateral organizations like the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund. Viviana is an investment manager with Climate Asset Management. She has over 15 years of extensive multidisciplinary and international experience in public-private approaches to environmental finance and biodiversity management. She was a partner at Wolf's Company, where she co-authored, as I mentioned, both the 2020 practice standards for conservation trust funds, as well as Conservation Trust Funds 2020 Global Vision Local Action. From 2015 to 2019, Viviana was also a legal consultant at the Green Climate Fund. Prior to becoming a consultant, she worked for 7 years as a senior finance associate at 2 major international law firms in the Netherlands, where she advised a wide range of actors on project finance, corporate finance, and climate finance transactions. Viviana has a law degree from the University of Costa Rica and a master's in environmental and resource management from VU University of Amsterdam. She's a kinship conservation fellow and a member of the Conservation Finance Alliance and Capitals Coalition Networks. Thank you, Viviana, so much for doing this. I turn the floor over to you.
Hi, Katie, and everybody that's listening. Thank you very much for joining the session, and to UCS, CFA, and RedLAC for inviting me. So as Katie mentioned, after a long time working on conservation for the past years, I joined this year Climate Asset Management, which is a joint venture of the Global Bank HSBC and the Climate Advisory Pollination, with the mandate of design a series of investment solutions on natural capital that will both generate financial returns and impact. So we're really glad to have the opportunity now to be on the side of the private capital and see how we can bridge that gap between private capital, conservation, and climate action. As Katie mentioned, I'm giving an introduction today on basically what is accreditation and what's the status of accreditation on conservation trust funds, and why are the practice standards a useful tool for accreditation. So basically, the first question is, what is accreditation? Is a buzzword, I think, for many of you, and it's basically, if we look at these 3 multilateral financing mechanisms, people call them funds or UN entities, depending on which one you look at. But in the end, they're basically a multilateral financing mechanisms which have received funding from a series of countries and are managed centrally to be able to provide funding. And the way they work is that they provide funding through a series of entities or organizations that have passed the accreditation process. I will come in a minute exactly what the accreditation process is about and what are the requirements. But once they have passed this process, it enables them to access to the funds directly from these financing mechanisms and bring them to the ground. So they all have different names, as you can see here. The GEF called them agencies. The Adaptation Fund has national implementing entities, multilateral implementing entities. We are talking here, when we talk about CTF, only the national implementing entities, and the Green Climate Fund called the accredited entities. But in the end, they all do the same, which is mainly creating projects, presenting project proposals, managing the projects on the ground. And while they do so, they also work with governments, non-governmental organizations, private sectors, and NGOs as the ones that either receive the funds or help implementing the projects on the ground, because some of these entities might not directly implement. They might just be the link between this financing mechanism and the implementation project on the ground. And in the case of the GCF, it's important to mention that because they have this very country-led approach, basically the accredited entities need to work directly with the local governments to design the proposals and ensure that it meets all their policy and objectives locally. In the 10-year review of the CTFs, which, as Katie mentioned, we did in parallel with the update of the practice standards, as part of the analysis of the evolving role of the CTFs, we look into the roles that CTFs are playing in fighting the climate crisis and supporting nature-based solutions for climate. And basically, we found out, not surprisingly, that achieving accreditation to the Adaptation Fund and the Green Climate Fund are part of this evolution, which perfectly fits in the role of CTFs as financial organizations with a global vision that support local action. As you can imagine, there are high bars set for CTFs who wish to become accredited with different global agencies. And to become accredited, CTFs must carefully consider the substantial financial and organizational investments required. But while CTFs describe this process as a lengthy and expensive one, they say that they have become, by becoming accredited, they have strengthened their seat at the table with the government counterparts. They have established effective risk management policies. They have strengthened their safeguards and administrative procedures. And most importantly, they have catalyzed additional funds for the countries and conservation objectives. And what the 10-year review also found out is basically, as you can see on this slide, and you will recognize many of the names, the CTFs with conservation endowments have been the first to invest in their own capacity to become accredited with multilateral agencies, thanks to the guaranteed flow of operation income and the strength of many established CTFs and their ability to leverage additional funding showcases that endowments can be considered investments in institutional capacity, securing long-term conservation activity while also allowing project funding in the short term to proceed. And of course, the implementation of the practice standards has also helped the CTFs to move into this accreditation process. So if we look at how many resources have been mobilized to date by these three agencies, around 65 million by the GEF. This is only one fund, Fumbio in Brazil. Adaptation Fund has mobilized close to 18 million, and the Green Climate Fund over $66 million. And this includes different types of projects. So it could be readiness or preparation funding, which, for example, for the Green Climate Fund is used to prepare, for example, climate policies, adaptation policies, also technical assistance to the accredited entities themselves, or, for example, governments or civil sector entities. And in total, this has been achieved through 23 projects for all these three agencies. But there are, of course, requirements to become accredited. So if we look at this list, which is quite extensive, the people that are familiar with the practice standards will recognize many of these topics as being addressed in the current update that was done in 2020. And not only does the CTF need to have all these policies and procedures and in place, but they also need to be compliant with the multilateral mechanism policies and procedures. So it may mean that having a gender policy in place might not be enough, but you will need to adapt it, or maybe you will need to adapt it if you request accreditation for it, for the three of them. So basically the full cost of implementation will have to be weighed against the benefits of accreditation. It might not be feasible, at least at one moment in time, for a CTF to do it, but it could be also like an ambition in the horizon. And this ties again into the importance of maintaining secure operational funding for CTFs to be able to invest in the systems that are needed for building a strong and transparent institution. As I just mentioned, CTFs with established and well-managed endowments that provide a stable annual income for operating expenses and organizational capacity building will be better able to invest in the needed safeguards for environmental, gender, ethics, indigenous communities, and transparency issues that will help them in the process of accreditation. As Katie mentioned, you can see on this slide all the areas of the practice standards. The ones here on the top are the core areas, which was increased with this new one, the risk management and safeguards. And these ones here are the 4 cross-cutting themes, which are not a core area on themselves, but they are mentioned, or they come into each of the core areas. So all the topics that are in yellow are the new additions or the new standards in this new revision of 2020. And as you can see from the previous list I showed, this very much has to do with the lessons learned and the requirements from working with donors and also with accreditation and with multilateral financing mechanisms. So basically, it has been an iterative process of the practice standard supporting accreditation, but also the accreditation process strengthening the practice standards to enhance this process. For a CTF to become accredited, like the Greek Climate Fund or the GEF, they need to demonstrate alignment with government-defined priorities and receive government endorsement to support accreditation steps. So this will also allow them to support government in the different actions and implementation of projects. The risk management and safeguards, as I mentioned, is one of the new core areas. This is also one of the most important, I think, areas for scrutiny by these entities when doing accreditation. So, as for people that don't know how the practice standards work, the practice standards does not mean that by adopting a standard, you automatically will have the risk management and safeguards in place, but basically practice standards explain to a CTF which risk management and safeguards they will need to have in place and gives them some explanation and background on how we'll need to do. So the evidence of complying in this case with the risk and safeguard standard would be having all these policies in place. Another important topic to mention is the monitoring and evaluation. This used to be a core area, but it was found during the review of the practice standards that monitoring and evaluation is not a standalone standard, but it actually also cross-cutting to all the different topics. And this also is relevant for the accreditation process, because as being an accredited entity means that you will have to have very strong monitoring and evaluation systems in place to be able to report yearly on the project implementation, but also on all your policies and procedures. So with this brief overview, I will hand it over to Katie and to the next two speakers, basically to explain how the practice standards have supported them in practice going through this accreditation process. Thank you very much, Katie.
Viviana, thank you so much for that overview and for the context on the accreditation process. I think of particular note is being aware of how many resources have been mobilized as a result of becoming accredited. It's become a powerful resource mobilization tool for the conservation trust funds that have gone through that process. So we'll now have two case studies by first the Micronesia Trust and then Pact Belize. I want to do a few quick reminders as we move through. If you have questions, please do put them into the Q&A. We'll do a full Q&A session with the panel at the end of the presentation. So please use that Q&A chat box to capture the questions that you have. I also wanted to highlight that there are links to the past webinars that we have run so far, as well as links to the tenure review and the practice standards in the chat as well. So at the moment, it's the middle of the night in Pohnpei, where Lisa Endon is based. And so Lisa is joining us by video. So I wanted to put up her picture. We will play the video where she has pre-recorded her presentation for today. Lisa Endon is the Deputy Executive Director of the Micronesia Conservation Trust. She previously worked for the Pohnpei State Government, where she was an executive assistant for the Economic Development Authority, and has also worked as a historic preservationist for the Division of Historic Preservation and Cultural Affairs. She earned her bachelor's in American Studies from Grinnell College and a master's in American Studies with a graduate certificate in Historic Preservation and concentrations in Pacific Island Studies and Cultural Resource Management from the University of Hawaii. She is a 2005 alumna of the University of California, Berkeley's Bears Environmental Leaders Program. She earned a Unitec New Zealand Pacific Conservation, NGO Management and Leadership Training course in 2010, earning a postgraduate certificate. Her work at the Micronesia Conservation Trust currently focuses on human resource work, as well as accreditation and other administration matters. So let me then turn the camera over to James to run the video, please.
Okay, thank you, everybody. My name is Lisa Ranahan Anton. I'm the Deputy Executive Director of the Micronesia Conservation Trust, and I'm happy to be presenting to you today. The Micronesia Conservation Trust, here is our mission and vision statements. Our vision is enduring partnerships that conserve our land and sea to improve the quality of life for communities across Micronesia. And in order to do this, we build partnerships, raise and manage funds, make grants, influence policy, and provide conservation and financing expertise. We work in the Federated States of Micronesia, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, the Republic of Palau, the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas, and the U.S. Territory of Guam. Our board is currently updating our strategic action plan, and there will be some minor changes to our vision and mission statements, but our work will remain basically the same going forward. We kind of work in the middle between external and national and regional entities, bringing in international funding, the ideas of thought leaders and conservation experts and international policy. We bring that into MCT and we disperse that knowledge and that funding to our local partners and to projects, community leaders, and Micronesian governments. And then similarly, we take the results of the work that they do and their thinking and what works on the ground here and funnel it back out to the wider world. We try to take at least 80% of the funding that we bring in is re-granted or goes directly to work on the ground. We try to keep our admin costs down as much as we can, and we connect Micronesia to the broader conservation community. So that's kind of the way we operate, general thinking. We were incorporated in 2002 in the Federated States of Micronesia as a charitable irrevocable corporation. Like I said, we serve all of the jurisdictions of the Northern Micronesia, American affiliated countries and territories. Our governing board consists of 7 regional trustees, 3 international trustees, one based in Japan, 1 based in the United States, and 1 based in Europe. And we have an ex officio donor representative. We maintain 501c3 tax exempt status in the United States. Currently, we have an endowment of roughly $27 million. The people that we serve include Micronesian conservation organizations, local governments, local communities, and technical partners. And we maintain accreditations with the Adaptation Fund and the Green Climate Fund. So in terms of the kinds of funds that we manage, we, like I said, have the Micronesia Challenge Endowment at $27 million. We have an operational endowment at about, oh, I'm sorry, I reversed those. The operational endowment is at about $1 million. And then the Yella Conservation Easement Endowment is at about $810,000. The Yella Conservation Easement is protecting a forest of kaw trees in Koshai. It's the only place on Earth where there's an existing viable stand of kaw trees. So this is a conservation easement protecting that area. We also manage several advised thinking funds from multiple donors, which include primarily US-based foundations, US federal agencies, and then multilateral facilities like the Adaptation Fund and the Green Climate Fund. So those funds average about $2.5 million a year, but we're expecting a big jump next year because of a new Green Climate Fund project. The regranting over the years, we've supported and are supporting over 150 sites across Micronesia. We also do capacity building and network coordination. 2 of the networks that we coordinate are the Micronesians and Island Conservation and the Pacific Islands Managed and Protected Areas Community. We also have several scholarship programs, internship programs, and legal fellows program. And then we also have a new sustainable livelihoods program. The 2 major projects there are Coconuts for Life and a Women Solar Engineers project in the state of Chuuk. And then we are starting a Green Climate Fund that project around climate smart agriculture projects. So in terms of our experience with accreditation, we are accredited to the Adaptation Fund and to the Green Climate Fund. For the Adaptation Fund, we submitted our initial application in April of 2012. It took 2 years of revisions and improvements to our organizational policies and back and forth with the fund's accreditation panel. And in 2014, they were satisfied with our application. Some of the work that we had to do included strengthening our procurement procedures, developing an anti-fraud policy and a whistleblower policy. Some comments that we got from the accreditation committee. There were a lot of concerns about the level of regranting in our grant management experience. They wanted documentation of grants that we made to Micronesian partners in the $1 to $3 million range, and the biggest grants that we'd made at that time were, averaging, 30 to 50,000, and we had like one $100,000 grant that we'd made, and so we weren't at the kind of funding level that they were expecting to be able to assess, and then we had to demonstrate that we had the capacity to manage the Adaptation Fund, the funding. We had to improve our monitoring and evaluation and the quality at entry. They wanted stronger oversight from our board of trustees. And then there was a long running conversation about internal audit. When we applied, we had a staff of, I think, 13, no, not even 10 people. And we just we didn't need and couldn't maintain an internal audit function. So there was a lot of back and forth about these kinds of things, which eventually resulted in the board approving a streamlined accreditation process, designed specifically for small NIEs. And so that process was approved by the board in October 2014, and we were finally accredited in March of 2015 with some conditions, that we were limited in the amount of money that we could, the size of project that we could request to $1 million. And then we had to specify procurement procedures for each project that we, submitted proposals for. And then again, that's the stronger oversight by the Board Committee on Investment, Audit, and Finance. And so that stronger oversight kind of satisfied their concerns over internal audit for the beginning of our role as NIE. We were reaccredited in June of this year, and then in getting reaccredited, they did increase our limit to $1,000 project approved in 2017, and we managed that well with our performance. 21, they increased our limit. For the Green Climate Fund, we were finally accredited in 2017 because organizations accredited to the Adaptation Fund, GEF, Europe Aid, and the European Commission are eligible for fast track accreditation. So they only would look at the requirements that were outside the scope of the first accreditation. In 2016, the Green Climate Fund was offering free assistance from PricewaterhouseCoopers to perform gap assessments for accreditation. So we took advantage of that opportunity, and we conducted the gap assessment as if we were applying for regular accreditation, not the fast track. So we wanted them to look at everything. We considered that assessment as an opportunity to gauge our improvements since the Adaptation Fund accreditation process. We did eventually go with a fast track process, but we went through the assessment as if we were trying to get accredited through regular channels. So the gap assessment again called out the internal audit issue. They wanted to see updated TORs for the board committees and employees, tweaks to financial management, more procedures around anti-terrorism, money laundering, fraud, and risk and environment and social risk mitigation, gender policy, communications, and monitoring and evaluation. The ones with the green check marks are things that we went ahead and addressed based on the gap assessment. Because the Green Climate Fund had really prioritized Pacific Island countries for direct access entities accreditation, we went ahead and took advantage of the fast track process because the Secretariat really encouraged us to do so. They wanted to have small island direct access entities accredited as soon as possible. So it was relatively fast after we did the gap assessment. So we were accredited in 2017 for micro level grants with the social and risk category of C, and the basic fiduciary standards, project management, and grant awards. So we're also accredited to re-grant funding from the GCF. We did our midterm accreditation review this year, and we continue to meet all of the relevant accreditation standards. And so the Secretary will be recommending to the board next month that we remain accredited. What we learned from the process is, and kind of our approach to it, was that we undertook the both accreditation processes as an exercise in building our own capacity for its own sake, in the interest of improving our organization in order to better serve our stakeholders. So our kind of thinking was that, regardless of whether we get accredited or not, we'll use this process and all of the external, assessments and questions and review processes as a way to make our organization better, just to get better. It was an opportunity to reevaluate our performance, our policies, and so on and so forth, just for its own sake, so that we could serve our stakeholders better. We were extremely persistent. We get really tough questions, and we'd had a lot of naysayers, and we, did our best to answer questions. And then we had to push back. Sometimes too, and just repeatedly tell the Adaptation Fund or the Green Climate Fund, hey, we don't have examples of $100 million projects that we've made to local stakeholders. We can't give you that, but here's what we do have. And so there was a lot of back and forth and around the internal audit issues, things like that. And we never ever hesitated to ask for help or to accept help when it was offered. And and from what may have seemed like unlikely sources, so we had to think creatively and see where we could find, help and assistance and support, endorsements, and so on. And again, push back and challenge when necessary. And then also be very aware of and leverage the fund's stated priorities. Like I said, with the Adaptation Fund, they had just, started a big push to accredit small entities, small direct access entities. And so, we kind of jumped on that and leveraged it, and we felt like we could push back because we knew that they really wanted us to be accredited at the end of the day. And so, and with the Green Climate Fund, the ambassador from Samoa had just stepped down as co-chair, and at the board meeting in Samoa, they announced a focus on accrediting Pacific Island entities. And so we kind of, we knew about that, and we had a lot of support in the Secretariat based on that, and took advantage of that, when we were going through the accreditation process. What might have we done differently? We probably would have sought assistance from fund-specific experts early in the process. We did get help from experts early in the process, but not ones that were specifically experts in the Adaptation Fund accreditation requirements or the GCF accreditation requirements. We had help from TNC, TNC financial management, procurement experts, and in kind of general expertise around accreditation processes and management issues and things like that, financial management and budgeting, but not ones that were specifically knowledgeable about the funds that we were, asking to be accredited to. Oh, it's not clear. So in terms of what might be the advantages, benefits of accreditation, we obviously are able to bring in increased funding for climate change adaptation work and projects. And then just having, that little check mark by accredited to Adaptation Fund, Green Climate Fund, and also the 501c3 status in the US, it improves donor confidence. Donors are, more, sure that we're able to manage any funding that they send our way. It also has heightened visibility of and awareness of our work, partly because, we were, the first really small accredited entity to the Adaptation Fund. We were one of the first accredited in the Pacific. So being the first was part of that, but just in general, being accredited to these entities, raises your profile. And it's also strengthened our governance and operational capacity. Drawbacks might include the increased internal organizational formality that's required. We have a small staff. We started very, very small and informal, and felt like we were nimble and flexible, and So the increased organizational formality required is sometimes uncomfortable for us. There's increased monitoring and reporting burdens, both for MCT and then we also then end up having to pass some of that on to our grantees. And they don't always have the capacity to do that, which then increases our workload helping them through these requirements. So it's kind of a vicious circle there. And we're working to deal with it. And it, and just the costs and time and effort to maintain the accreditations and the manage the added requirements. And then for the core topic of this session, I think, is the relevance of the practice standards for the CTFs. This document wasn't available actually when we first began our accreditation journey, but it really would have been useful if it had been available, because the standards that are in the document are really in line with adaptation fund and GCF requirements for policies and documentation. And the policies and types of documents and evidence and supportive procedures that were requested by the adaptation fund and the GCF are included in the standards. So if you have all of these things in place, going through the accreditation process would most likely just require like small tweaks in what you have existing, because the standards are very much in line with what's expected of organizational management. And I think that's the end of my presentation. So I'll say kalangan, which is thank you, here on Pohnpei. Oh, I'm sorry, the email address is incorrect. I'm Lisa Ranahan Endon, and it's deputy@ourmicronesia.org rather than adaptation. And those are our social media connections. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, James, and thank you to Lisa remotely. As she mentioned at the end of her presentation, the correct email address for her is deputy@ourmicronesia.org, and that link, that information is in the chat. So she is happy to have you reach out to her with additional questions, since she's obviously not here for the Q&A. I am now going to turn the screen over to Nayari Diaz-Perez from the PACT Belize. Nayari is the Executive Director of the Protected Area Conservation Trust, or PACT, in Belize. She is a Belizean professional in the conservation sector with over 17 years experience in protected area financing, policy planning, development and implementation, as well as climate finance, and has substantial experience in actively engaging with private, public, and civil society organizations, both nationally and regionally, as well as with multilateral and international institutions. Nayari, thank you for sharing your experiences with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be able to share the experience of PACT Belize as it relates to the practice standards for CTFs in the context of the accreditation to the GCF and the Adaptation Fund. In addition to my work as Executive Director of PACT, I also led the process of accreditation and re-accreditation of PACT to both the Adaptation Fund and the Green Climate Fund. PACT is a quasi-government national conservation trust fund of Belize. It was established in 1996 via statutory legislation, and we are governed by a multi-stakeholder board of directors that includes representation from civil society, private sector, as well as government representatives. We have the institutional mandate and mission to contribute to the financial sustainability and management effectiveness of the National Protected Area System of Belize via high impact investments and strategic partnerships. We are a founding member of the Mesoamerican Reef Fund. We're a member fund of RedLAC, and we're also a member of the IUCN. We generate our revenues from tourism fees that are legislated revenue streams for the trust fund. We manage an endowment fund and we manage sinking funds. We are accredited by Adaptation Fund. We were accredited in 2011. Re-accredited in 2018, and we are also accredited to the Green Climate Fund, which we also attained in 2018. We also have fiduciary management arrangements with the World Bank, IUCN, CCAD, among others. We see the voluntary practice standards as an effective tool in the process of accreditation, because it allows for self-assessment of the institution that basically informs your readiness for accreditation. It complements the self-assessment tool that is available from the Green Climate Fund, for instance, that allows you to take stock of what your institutional capacity is and your level of readiness to enter the accreditation process. And we recommend that any CTF that is interested in getting accreditation access the practice standards and utilize it for that purpose. Conservation trust funds that have been applying the standards since they were first published in 2014 are likely to be at a more moderate level of readiness because the practice standard serves as a tool for continuous improvement of CTFs. So in our experience, we had been applying them and they proved quite useful in the process. And so it is a tool that we encourage all CTFs to use before they enter the process of accreditation. The accreditation process has different and varying sets of criteria, and fiduciary criteria or fiduciary and financial management standards are one of the set of standards that are more readily met by conservation trust funds, especially the older ones, the more mature ones, as FACT was at the time. Because by nature, we are already financial mechanisms that have financial management, internal controls, auditing, governance, and all of that in place. And so those can be more easily met. However, risk management and safeguards is one other aspect of the accreditation criteria that has more recently become more pronounced as a criteria by the accreditation process, and is also one that was largely absent, at least in formal structure, from some of these older CTFs, like PACT. In our case, we did have a risk management framework in place, but they were not as formally structured as they need to be to meet the criteria for accreditation. And so in 2020, with the update to the practice standards, that actually directly responds to what we would consider as one of the most prevalent gaps in CTFs, especially perhaps some of the older ones that, as I said, perhaps may not have had these frameworks in place as structured as they need to be. The newer CTFs that would be seeking accreditation would be at the advantage that they would have this available to guide that process. And so, as I mentioned, PACT received accreditation from the Adaptation Fund in 2011 and the GCF since 2018. And the standards proved useful and relevant in the process for us to prepare to get us reaccredited by the Adaptation Fund, which by that time that we were up for reaccreditation had actually expanded its requirements because it has also been a learning process for the funds as well. And so since we had been accredited by the Adaptation Fund, we were subjected to what the GCF calls the fast track accreditation process. Now, how fast that will be largely depends on your ability to meet those criteria and fill any gaps that there may exist. And because PACT had been using the practice standards as a strategy for our institutional strengthening over the years, we have actually tailored them to suit our unique characteristics. as I had shared earlier, we are a quasi-government trust fund, which is not your traditional private independent trust fund. And the practice standards, while they center or target private independent trust funds, they can be suited to the nature of any conservation trust fund, independent of whether you're a new trust fund, whether you're an older trust fund, or a semi-public trust fund, as is the case with PAP. And so we had been tailoring them and utilizing them. And so it was to our advantage when it came time to do our self-assessment and determine how ready we were for the purpose of accreditation and reaccreditation. So the younger conservation trust funds have the advantage of having the practice standards as a guide to their development, and they can readily use them to ready themselves for that process. The accreditation process is going to be as easy as you are ready. It largely depends on how quickly a CTF can fill any gaps that are identified by the process. And so if the practice standards are already being applied, as was with our experience, it is an advantage, and it will make a huge difference in the experience that the CTF will have. Of course, this will be unique to every CTF depending on the nature of the gaps that need to be filled. But the accreditation process itself is an evidence-based process. And so all the frameworks, the policies, the manuals, everything that we find in the practice standards as being the outputs that have to be in place, they have to be in full effect and practice. So the existence of a policy does not guarantee that you meet the criteria for accreditation when it comes to that particular requirement. So these frameworks and policies and manuals can't just exist for you to tick off a checklist, for instance. This is where the assessment tool of the practice standards becomes very useful and relevant, because if you've been using that assessment tool to determine how effectively you have been applying those standards and how effectively you have been meeting those standards in the natural course of your growth as a conservation trust fund, your development as a conservation trust fund, then that is going to provide that baseline that you need, and it's going to inform whether you are ready or not ready. As Lisa mentioned in her video presentation, there will be things that you simply will not have, and you have to demonstrate. You have to show that you are capable of managing multilateral funds in every aspect of management, from the fiduciary internal controls to the project implementation and to the stakeholder engagement and communications as well. So it's all of these aspects that you have to demonstrate, and it's a process that's very evidence-based. Also, and because of that, accreditation is a process that might appear to be onerous to some CTFs, and we found that in our engagement with other CTFs and even other agencies that are not CTFs that have sought our assistance with the accreditation process. And although it might appear to be a tedious process, it also brings many benefits to conservation trust funds. What we have found was beneficial to us, and some of the benefits that we have seen is that it has allowed us for marked institutional strengthening, to achieve marked institutional strengthening. We had been using the practice standards throughout the years, ever since they became available. As a member of RedLAC, we have been utilizing those as our own internal strategy to continuously build the capacity of our organization to deliver on its mandate. But going through the accreditation process actually takes you up a notch when it comes to really targeting those areas of capacity that may have existed and you were challenged to fill. And so it has really allowed for us to have a comprehensive look at where those gaps have been, all the way from governance and strengthening of our governance systems, all the way to extending out to the project cycle and how we invest in the projects and programs that we support, and also benefited our stakeholders as well. So the institutional strengthening and the capacity building has extended beyond just us as the Conservation Trust Fund, but even our partners and beneficiaries and grantees that we work with. It also has allowed us to benefit from enhanced resource mobilization capacity, which is the most obvious and the one that is the benefit that we're all looking for when we enter into this process. And so we have been able to mobilize these resources that can be considered to be from non-traditional sources. As conservation trust funds, we all are heavily dependent on grant funding when we started back in the early years, and so we have been able now to access these climate funds and direct access at that, which is something that was not available to us in the past. What it has also allowed us to do, and this is more at the when you start considering your institutional mandate, is that it has allowed us to have a more expanded role nationally, and with that, we've also then expanded our reach and our impact in Belize, and so we have been able to expand the work that we do essentially. And so one of the greatest benefits is that PAC has been able to access readiness grants to continue our own capacity building, and even extend that to the capacity building of our grantees and other national stakeholders. We have also developed a pipeline of projects valued at about $20 million that in projects that seek to advance our institutional mandate, as well as the wider biodiversity, climate change, and overall sustainable development agenda of Belize. And being an accredited entity has also allowed us to expand our networking and the benefits that come with that. We are a member of the community of practice of direct access entities and national implementing entities of the Adaptation Fund and Green Climate Fund. And we're also a member of the network of direct access entities of GCF for the Caribbean. And so this has really been beneficial to the institutional growth of PACT and allowed us to advance in the work that we do and leverage the funds that we do have available by accessing the climate funds that allow us to continue to do our work. Thank you. I'll leave it at that.
Mary, thank you so much for sharing your experiences and your perspectives. That was incredibly comprehensive and really provided, I think, the level of detail that people are interested in hearing. So I really appreciate that. I am not sure how much time we will have for questions, but I do want to identify that there are a few questions in the Q&A. One in particular that I wanted to, I think, turn to you, Neri, to follow up on. You had mentioned that PACT is a quasi-governmental and private conservation trust fund, and a question that was posed in the Q&A is whether national CTFs are eligible for accreditation. Can you just talk a little bit about that distinction between what the accreditation bodies are looking for in terms of institutional structure, institutional governance?
Yeah, both the Adaptation Fund and the Green Climate Fund are focused on what they term as country ownership. And so they place priority on the accreditation of national institutions to serve the roles of national implementing entity and direct access entity. In the case of the adaptation fund, they have one national implementing entity per country. And so as part of their process for selecting who is accredited, you have to go through a nomination process nationally. And so the designated authority of the country, that is the designated authority to the fund in question, needs to go through the process of identifying a nominee and making a nomination to the fund for that entity to go through the accreditation process. In this case, our national designated authority to the adaptation fund is our Ministry of Finance, and they identified PACT for our experience or track record as a financial mechanism to serve that role. In the case of the Green Climate Fund, they can have multiple direct access entities nationally. And so PACT is the first for Belize and the second in the region, in the Caribbean region, sorry. But we are also already assisting other national institutions within Belize to get accreditation for the other categories that we are not accredited for, such as on lending and on granting, on lending. So yes, national CTFs can be accredited as long as you meet the criteria.
Great, thank you. Let me identify one or two other quick questions that were raised in the Q&A. Senso has asked about whether the presentations will be available after the webinar. We will, with the permission of the presenters, we will post PDFs of the presentation on the Conservation Finance Alliance website. We did put the link to the webinars page earlier up in the chat, so you can find them there. I also want to highlight that the practice standards, while they are currently in English, they have been translated into French and Spanish, and we are just going through the graphic design process so that we can release the translated versions of the standards shortly. And lastly, I want to flag that the Conservation Finance Alliance has a LinkedIn discussion group for its members. It is free to join the CFA, so we encourage everyone to be a CFA member if you are not already, but we can continue the conversation on this and other topics related to the practice standards in that LinkedIn group. So Kumar has put the link to that group in the chat. Thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you to Nare, to Viviana, and remotely to Lisa for your sharing of your experiences and wisdom on this. And I will turn it back over to Merluisa. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. And thank you everyone for your participation in this session. We are finishing the second day, and I would just like to give a little bit of information about the sessions for tomorrow. We will begin, and this one is only for members of RedLAC or CAFE. We will begin with a meeting to prepare for international negotiations and the accomplishment of the 2030 goals that will happen tomorrow, early in the morning for Latin America and this side of the world, and in the early afternoon for Europe and Africa. And then we will move on to two sessions. One will be on blue and green economy, and another one on the implementation of the PFP model, of the Project Finance for Permanence model among CTFs. And then we will be ending with a cultural activity. We will have a presentation by a Costa Rican musician who has earned several Grammys. And then we will move on to a virtual party. That virtual party will be in the Remo platform. So the idea is that we can be there and move from one table to the other, connect with people, have quick interactions, just as if we were networking in a real life cocktail. So we are really looking forward to that, and we hope that you can take advantage of it. If you need information about how to get onto Remo, We advise that you do that in advance. You create your profile, upload your picture, and get a little bit familiarized with the platform. You can find this information in the event website, so in www.redlac2021.org. So we ask you to please do that in advance, and we'll see you tomorrow for our last day of the Congress. Thank you.